Yo, what's going on, Time Clan? It is your boy King Tynex here, back with another video, and you guys already know the deal. This is going to be what if Issei was the son of Anubis. Now, this is going to be an interesting what if, considering the fact that, well, we are dealing with Egyptian gods in this what if, and I get to explore like a whole another lore that I kind of basically can create in a way. Yeah, in a way, I can basically create my own lore for this series. And as you guys can probably figure, Neptune did help me when it came on to the planning of how this would go. So if you guys are interested in Neptune's lore content, be sure to check the link in the description. I have the link to her Wattpad in the description. Anyways, let's get with the video. Let's get on with the video. To say that Issei's life was anything but normal was an understatement. You see, being the son of an Egyptian god, let alone the Egyptian god of death himself, Anubis, or at least in some versions, many people seem to have variations of who was necessarily the god of death in Egyptian mythology. But when it came on to Issei, he didn't really focus that much on it. He figured that his father had control over certain aspects of death, especially when it came on to the embalming process for the dead as well. When it came on to Issei, he was meant to take over the mantle of his father one day, just like his father did as well. When it came on to Osiris, Anubis was eventually the one to take over the role of being the god of death. When it came on to Issei, he was meant to be the one to take over when he became an adult as well, when he became of age to take over the throne in a sense. And because of this, Issei ended up having to become mature, you could say, at an earlier age. His father made sure to instruct Issei on how to act, how to do this, do that. He would learn many things from his father over the years, learning how to manage the dead, learn how to use his powers, his magnificent powers in his own opinion. And Issei, as I've said before, he would learn to behave more properly, you could say. He would act more accordingly in terms of how somebody who had control over the dead should act. He was not necessarily brash, but he wasn't the most calm person in the world still. He was still a teenager, or at least in terms of Egyptian lifespans, you could say a teenager, and therefore Issei still had a lot of learning to go through. He still had a lot to learn, even though he was coming closer to adulthood by the day, or well, year. Issei figured that he would just live most of his life in Egypt though. He would continue to learn from his father, gain all of these studies from his father, and just go on to take over the mantle one day. But his comfortable life in Egypt would be interrupted one day. Issei would be confused. What exactly did his father want with him today? He thought it was going to be one of his days where he actually had a break from studying on how life worked. But apparently, his father had something different in mind. His father, Anubis, explained that there was some sort of situation happening in Japan when it came on to the different mythologies, these different factions, more so focused in the Christian and Catholic realm of factions, you could say, which left Issei in curiosity. He didn't really hear that much about the other factions. Sure, he knew that they existed, but he figured that they were their very own domain. That wasn't necessarily something that he needed to get involved with, ever. But apparently his father mentioned that normally it would be the case that he should not get involved, but in this case the magic was fluctuating. The factions, they were becoming a bit too involved in human affairs. His father wanted Issei to go check it out. He wanted to see if he was overreacting or not. He didn't want to snoop in personally. If Anubis of all people, or well, beings, were to go all the way to Japan, a lot of people would notice that, but when it came out to Issei, he was still a minor god in the sense. Issei still had a lot of growth to go through, and therefore, going to Japan wouldn't really bat an eye in most of the factions' opinion, or like, I phrase that pretty terribly. Basically, Issei wouldn't really be seen as much of a threat in many other factions' eyes. Therefore, they wouldn't really bat an eye when it came onto Issei going over to Japan to check it out. Sure, he was an Egyptian god, but there wasn't really much that he was controlling over just yet. He still hadn't set up a name for himself as of yet. As for his father Anubis, he's been here for far longer. He's been there since the Holy Wars, the Great Faction War, all of these wars. He's been around for eons essentially. So he already set up his own position. He set up his title in the world. Now it was time for Issei to go check out what's happening on the other side. Especially since when it came onto Egypt, there wasn't really much going on, and if Issei was going to become the next heir to the throne, well, he was going to have to get more experience, outside experience you could say, dealing with people from the outside. Learn how these people react, learn how they talk, learn how all of these different people react to different situations. Basically get a feel for what humanity is like. Issei was a god, but that didn't necessarily mean that he had to completely detach himself from humanity. Issei needed to learn some form of humility after all. If he just stayed cooped up in the afterlife, or like the underworld, well no, just afterlife, then he would never gain an understanding for what humanity was really like, and that was an important call when it came on to judging the hearts of humans as well. Issei would be annoyed, but he would listen to his father in the end, especially considering how his father was leagues above him in terms of strength and abilities, and his father was eons wiser than Issei would ever be. At least for now anyways. He was of course still a teenager, while his father, well, you get the point. Issei would be enrolled into Kuo Academy, in which he would just learn about the people. He would be more of an observant person, you could say, rather than being a pervert like his usual self, always trying to peek into girls' locker rooms. Issei in this version, he wasn't really interested in that. He just wanted to go back home. He was honestly pretty annoyed with how most people reacted. Some people, they were often just too loud and brash for his liking. But Issei, he would still try to keep a cool head for the most part. That was until he met a crimson-haired girl with green eyes, and she also had a friend with jet black hair. Their names were Rias and Akano. Just by looking at them, Issei would already know that these girls were different from the rest. They had a different aura to them. He would have realized right then and there that they were devils. They were pretty obvious in his opinion. Their energy was practically leaking out when it came on to Issei's sensing abilities. Issei just tisked, considering how easy it was for him to just discover them. When it came on to Sona Citri, At the very least, it took him a little longer to figure out that she was a devil. He did not necessarily look at her the same as Rias and Akino. Basically, when it came on to Sona, she was harder to get a grasp for. Rias and Akino, they exerted their devil's energy in a less conspicuous way. Or inconspicuous. Basically, it's like this. Sona had an easier time controlling her devil's energy. She kept it more concealed than Rias and Akino, although they weren't necessarily all that aware of it. Issei was able to tell it from a mile away. Issei would just call them out for it as well. Rias and Akino, they would actually be surprised to find that Issei was able to figure out that they were devils, and this would immediately put them on high alert. How did this kid know about their true identities? Issei would go on to explain that it was pretty obvious their energy was practically leaking out of them. They needed to do a better job, in all honesty, at keeping their energy concealed. Sure, they were in a human realm in which most humans are not able to really sense energy like that or see that sort of energy either, but there are some that would probably be able to find it. There are some powerful humans out there he is aware of. He's heard of some powerful humans throughout history, and they were not necessarily the fondest of devils either, meaning that if they weren't careful, they could get themselves killed. Rias would question who exactly Issei was. How was he able to sense them? Was he like one of those humans or something? Was he like a magician? Issei would kind of snort hearing this. No, I'm not necessarily a human, Issei would say. I'm more like what you guys would consider to be, well, an angel, or like, in this case, you can call me a god. I am the Egyptian god Issei. Issei would, well, explain. Issei would also explain that when it came on to him, he was more so focused on the aspects of death when it came on to the Egyptians, which intrigued Rias to an extent. She was curious now. If Issei was an Egyptian god who had control over the aspects of death, would that mean that he could maybe help her in this situation of hers? Rias would go on to actually ask Issei if he could help her. He would be offered a great amount of items, from riches to women, all of those sorts. Issei would just laugh at all of Rias's offers just to get Issei's help. Issei would explain to Rias that he already had plenty of that stuff. He had control over the dead. Pretty much every pharaoh is under his control, essentially. Every pharaoh throughout history, their wealth belonged to Issei. Well, it belonged to his father, but you get the point. Every Egyptian that's ever died, every Egyptian's money basically belonged to Issei and the rest of the gods. But when it came onto the sands as well, if any sort of gold would have fallen into the sand, or any gold that lay in the sands, that belonged to Issei, and that meant the sand throughout all of time, all of the gold throughout history that's ever been fought with or fought for in wars Many people who have died in the sands and in the sandy dunes of Egypt. Basically, anybody who's ever died in war from diseases, any sort, especially if they died in the sands. They belong to Issei. All of their wealth belonged to Issei's family. So of course he had no concern when it came on to money. Every pharaoh's wealth belonged to Issei. So why would he be concerned about how much money that Rias could give him? When it came on to other things like women, Issei did not really care about that. Sure, he may be interested in women to a certain extent, but not to the point where you could just be bribing him with them. That was ridiculous in Issei's opinion. Rias would explain why she even wanted Issei's help in the first place. That being, of course, that she wanted to get out of this arranged marriage between her and this Riser Phoenix guy from the Phoenix clan. Apparently, her family and the Phoenix clan family also, well, not also, but the two families decided to work out an agreement. They wanted to produce more naturally born devils into the world. Strong devils at that, and by having two of the strongest clans, the Grimoire clan and the Phoenix clan, basically come together and have kin with each other, that could create for an ultimate weapon of sorts. Very powerful offspring. Although it would probably take a while, considering how, when it came out to devils, they seemed to have a harsher time when it came on to, well, trying to reproduce. It was as if most of the time they were infertile or whatever. It basically took longer for them to get pregnant. Issei would listen to Rias' story and he would understand where she was coming from. He understood that from his time in Egypt, he'd seen many arranged marriages, and not all of them were always that pretty. Some of them ended up with the wives being depressed. Sometimes the husbands, they were abusive, or it could be the other way around at times, where the wife was abusive to the husband, and that led to the husband deciding to just end it all. Sometimes the husband would lose his sanity because of this woman. Although this man would usually be disrespected by his fellow peers afterwards. Even after he died, when they heard the news, they would just laugh and mock him for it, just allowing his woman to walk all over him. In that sort of society, it was a pretty cruel society at times, but Issei had to admit that it just seemed to be a norm within many societies at this point that women were always seen as lesser than men. They were seen as a weaker of the two, which was not necessarily wrong, but at the same time, and it basically meant that women were fragile while men were supposed to be the tough people out there. As for Rias now, it seemed as if she was embodying the very same thing. She was on the more fragile side. That's why she could not just necessarily fight her way out of the marriage. At least, that's what he thought at first. Until Rias mentioned that she would be willing to do practically anything to get out of this marriage, even if it meant that she had to fight Riser to the death or something along those lines. She would be willing to do it. Issei would listen to her and he would explain something to her. He would explain that right now she seems to be fairly weak. Even Issei, while he was a child, was probably stronger than Rias at this age. Rias felt offended, but Issei would continue. He would explain that he's not necessarily allowed to interfere in these sort of affairs, or at least directly get involved in these sort of affairs. The best that he could probably do is to maybe train up Rias with some of his dead soldiers. That's probably something that he would be allowed to do. Rias would think about it for a minute. Train with dead soldiers. That was a bit odd, but Issei would explain further. He would explain the whole purpose of training with his dead soldiers would be to build up her combat skills, and since these soldiers were already dead, she did not necessarily have to hold back. He could make these soldiers regenerate. He could make these soldiers come back every single time, so long as he had the mana, you could say, or the energy, if he was willing to do it, any of that sort. He could have them come back each and every time. He could even bring Rias and her group to, well, his domain. His domain being the afterlife, the Egyptian afterlife, where she could fight entire armies just so that she could become stronger. Well, he probably wasn't going to do that. She needed to offer him something extremely valuable if he were to send her to his domain just so that she could train. But for right now, he would be willing to help her as just a token of good faith. He wanted to build connections with these new, not really new, but with these, well, different factions. He wanted to build these connections so that they would be on good terms for later on in the future. Rias would think about it for a minute, until she decided that she would be willing to take the offer. It seemed like an offer that was too good to be true, and it really just depended on what she was willing to do in the end, if she was willing to put in that sort of effort. Issei would smile hearing that she accepted his offer. He wasn't going to be light on her training whatsoever, or at least he was not going to necessarily be light on her training. It was more so what Rias wanted in the end. If she was really that desperate to get out of this arranged marriage, then she would put in all the effort possible. Rias would go on to confront her brother and demand that she be taken out of this arranged marriage. If she had to fight Ryza in a rating game, then so be it. Sir Zex would listen to his little sister and he would shrug. If she wanted to get out of this marriage so badly, then so be it. He would have a rating game arranged for a month from there on. And of course, Rias would have her whole group go to one of her many estates, you could say. This would be for training purposes. Issei would supply Rias with some of his undead soldiers. They were skeletons, but they were strong skeletons, you could say. He basically reinforced their strength, their speed, their durability, also that they would be good training dummies for Rias's group. A whole month would pass with these guys constantly fighting this group of undead soldiers. Issei would have easily been able to keep it up to where they would not necessarily disappear. They would, anytime the soldiers ever were struck enough to where they would begin to turn to dust, he would just have them be reformed. Every time they broke down, he would reform them just like that. They would be fixed and they would be good to go. Right more. Basically what I'm trying to say is that every time these skeleton soldiers were defeated, they would just regenerate. They would come back and fight once more. Every single time, they would not necessarily give Rias's group that much of a break. As long as Rias's group approached them, they would go on to fight each other. That was basically it. But Rias after a time, got lazy. She figured that she was strong enough after a certain point, rather than trying to use that full month to, well, fight the skeleton soldiers. She eventually decided to give it a break. She figured that she deserved to give her group a rest from fighting these soldiers that Issei also graciously set up for her. The whole plan was for them to fight the soldiers every single day and night, for a whole month straight, gaining combat skills and abilities so that they will be ready for the rating game eventually. But Rias ended up becoming too cocky, and she would learn the hard way. This hard way being, of course, when she had to go on and eventually fight Riser Phoenix's peerage. And although they were stronger in this timeline, well, Rias still ended up losing. It was a hard fought battle, but even Rias wasn't able to stand up to Riser in the end. Riser was just too strong, or more so, his regeneration was too strong, his healing flames, all of that sort. The Phoenix's clan's ability was just too overwhelming for the Remery peerage, and of course, Rias would be forced to marry Riser in the end, although she was greatly annoyed by it. Issei would hear the news one day and he wouldn't be all that surprised. He could tell that Rias had begun to wane off on her training. She was meant to train for that whole month, but after a time Issei was realizing that his soldiers, they weren't in need of regenerating as much. As a matter of fact, days would have gone by where he just felt his soldiers not really doing anything. They were just standing around, just watching, waiting for Rias's group to approach them. But of course, Rias's group, they would just stay away from the soldiers after a time. The only one that really walked up to the soldiers would be, well, Kiba, in order to strengthen his sword skills, which Issei could respect. He could see through his dead soldiers' eyes as well. He had that ability, so he was able to see everything that Rias's group was doing for a time, and he would have just face-palmed. They were basically wasting such a great opportunity, so it wouldn't be of any shock to Issei to find out that Rias's group ended up losing in the end to the Riser Phoenix peerage. That's what happens when you get cocky in this world. That's what happens when you become too easygoing, you could say. Bad things happen. That's something that his father taught him from a very young age. Never become comfortable. Always try to pursue more in life. Never become comfortable, never become stationary. If you become stationary, then that means that you are no longer living, essentially. You're just letting the elements take over. The only time you should ever be stationary, the only time you should ever be comfortable, the only time you should ever stop moving is when you're dead. And they have incredibly long lifespans. They're pretty much immortal, so unless you are killed, don't ever stop moving. And unfortunately, that's exactly what Rias did, so she paid the consequences. The consequences, of course, being getting married to Riser Phoenix. And Issei wasn't the type of guy to get all that mixed in with family affairs either, so he would have just left the situation there. Issei would now focus on himself more. He would have been, well, not necessarily himself, but more so the culture of Japan. He would have been interested in finding out more about the cultural differences between Japan and Egypt. And to his shock, it was very different. Well, not really to his shock. He wasn't really that surprised to find out that they were radically different cultures, but he was intrigued. He was intrigued to find out more about this culture. So intrigued though that he would end up noticing like energy spikes as well. And he would be curious about that as well. He would be curious about all of Japan at this point. He would realize that there were yokai in this land. He would realize that there were angels, fallen angels, and devils as well, all around just Japan itself. He wondered why that was the case, but he wouldn't really question it that much. Instead, he would be questioning more so the energy spikes. Every now and then, he would realize that there were large gaps of energy, or like large increases of energy, spiritual energy, and then it would immediately drop right after. He would be questioning why that was the case, and he would even go on to investigate one day. Following the energy spikes, he would be led to an area where it was practically filled with cult members. A bunch of people were wearing these cloaks or like robes which concealed their faces, and Issei would continue to feel the energy spikes, and he would just immediately go in. He would just take down most of these members. Most of these guys are wearing these cloaks, these robes. They would be pretty much easy for Issei to take down. Issei would have realized that these guys would have been a problem, but he didn't necessarily kill them. He just knocked them all unconscious. He would walk into the area. He would walk into the building, more so, I should say. And he would go on to explore just what exactly was happening. He would follow the energy spikes, and he would get closer and closer. The more closer he got, the more he felt the energy spikes, and eventually he would find his way all the way down to a secluded area at the very bottom of the building. It seemed to be underground actually, and Issei would have realized right then and there what exactly was going on. Apparently, there was some fallen angels here, and they were trying to extract something. They were trying to extract a blonde girl's sacred gear. It seemed as if they were extracting sacred gears from a lot of people actually. The last one that seemed to be extracted was a red gauntlet for whatever reason. Issei would have realized right then and there that these guys need to be stopped. These guys are probably rogue fallen angels, and therefore he had free domain to kill these guys. He had free domain to get involved because they weren't necessarily connected to the fallen angel faction whatsoever. So with this now being made aware to Issei, he would go on to attack these guys, and he would pretty much mollywop every last one of them. I'm gonna be 100% honest. These guys were small fry for Issei. He would have created a skeletal sword, you could say, or not necessarily a skeletal sword, more so just a sword made out of bones that he would have created from, well, one of his many undead soldiers. And this sword he would imbue it with life energy as well, or not life energy, the opposite of life energy. It would be death energy, you could say. He would be imbuing it with his own aura, and with this aura it would be a deathly aura that even the fallen angels could feel, and they would begin to get sick from it actually. They would become nauseous when in close proximity of Issei. Issei would just use this opportunity in order to slash each and every last one of them to pieces. And the interesting thing about, well, Egyptian gods like Issei was that if they killed you, regardless of if you were a fallen angel, a Norse god, any of those things, it didn't matter what exactly you were. You could be Opus for crying out loud. But if they killed you, you would be sent to the Egyptian afterlife. Not your own, their own, the Egyptian afterlife, where Anubis would be the one to basically tell what your fate would be at that point. Issei would immediately contact his father and explain the whole situation to him, why these three fallen angels were in his domain all of a sudden. And after hearing the news, Anubis would understand where Issei was coming from. He was glad that his son also informed him as well. It really did seem like the lessons were really getting through to his son now. He was glad to see that his teachings were really showing in Issei and his development and how he acted in this different realm, this whole new world, you could say. Now it was time to judge these fallen angels. Issei would have disconnected from his father, or well, he would not necessarily pay attention to what the fates of these angels would be. He pretty much already knew what it was going to be just from their actions earlier. But Issei would go on to untie the blonde girl. She would explain that her name was Asya and she was glad that he had saved her, because it felt like her life energy was literally being drained out of her, which Issei would explain that she wasn't very far off from that explanation that she just gave him. That was pretty much what was happening already. She wasn't far off in believing that, to be honest, because they were trying to take away her sacred gear, which in a sense was her life energy. You take away the sacred gear and you take away the person's life. Asya would be horrified hearing this, and she would give her own backstory as well. Well, after they got to really know each other, Issei would ask her where she wanted to go, and she would explain that she really had nowhere to be, because the fallen angels were the ones to basically take her in. She thought that they would be the ones to help her in restoring her relationship with God, the biblical God, to be more specific. Issei would hear this and he would just frown. These fallen angels were trying to manipulate Asya, and from the seams of it, she seemed like a pretty pure girl. Finding out that she had nowhere to go either made Issei pretty upset. This girl was basically used this whole entire time, and now that they finally had no use for her anymore, they tried to take away her life, take away her sacred gear. Issei just found that to be unacceptable, unredeemable, as a matter of fact. He was hoping that these guys got the worst punishment ever, but knowing his father, he probably wasn't too concerned about that. He would just try to act impartial for the most part. Issei still had a bit of a temper at times, although he hated to admit it. Issei, knowing that Asya had nowhere to go, to offer her a home of sorts. You see, Issei was basically renting out a place, or well, not really renting out a place. Basically, thanks to his amazing, family wealth, his family wealth extending for like generations at this point, he was able to supply himself with a pretty nice place in Japan to stay at for a good while. And of course, he would offer up a room to Asya. He had a lot of rooms, he just never really used much of them. As a matter of fact, he pretty much just slept on the couch most of the time. So Asya could just sleep in one of the rooms and he wouldn't even really know that she was there. Asya would cheer hearing this and she would accept it. She would accept this opportunity because, well, she really had nowhere else to go. And hearing this from Issei, the person who had just saved her, would make it even better in her opinion. This would essentially be the start of a new relationship of sorts. Over time, Asya would get to know more about Issei, and she would begin to admire him the more and more that she learned about him, eventually to the point where she would even try to offer herself as a servant to Issei. She wanted to help in his endeavors after all, and if she could become a servant, well, that would mean she could become even closer to Issei as well. She wanted to be of some use to Issei after all of the help that he brought towards her. He had literally saved her life and gave her a roof over her head as well. Gave her a home, and she even was provided food as well. Food, shelter, life, all of these things Issei basically offered her, and she felt like a freeloader at times. She didn't want to feel like that. She wanted to be of use to Issei, like I said before. So offering herself as a servant to Issei was her natural conclusion. Over time, Issei would question whether she really wanted to be his servant or not, but she would insist on becoming one. So Issei would do exactly that. He would put his sort of seal on Asya's neck, and it would also cause for her clothes to shift to be more so that of an Egyptian woman's, like a belly dancer, you could say. And Asya would also notice that her strength felt, well, let me repeat this. Basically, she felt stronger in a way. She felt better. She felt stronger than she had ever been just by becoming Issei's servant. And Issei would explain the whole issue of becoming a servant of an Egyptian god. Basically, they gained some of the Egyptian god's powers. Now, which kind of power? Well, that was entirely dependent on, well, their personality, their moveset, all of that. The Egyptian god, basically, Issei didn't really have control over what sort of power that Asya got. It was pretty much random. It pretty much just relied on what sort of person they already were, and therefore, Asya's ability was, well, death manipulation to an extent. She had her healing abilities, well, enhanced, but she also gained control over death to an extent. Not necessarily to where she could summon soldiers or anything, but she would find that she could, well, use her healing abilities in the opposite direction. Rather than heal a person, she could basically cause that person to decay. She could cause that person's body to rot from the inside out, and therefore she could kill that person just by a single touch, which was terrifying, but she would make sure to use that power into great use in order to serve Issei well. But she would not be the only one of her servants to come. She would only be the first of many. And this is basically where I'm going to end part 1 for now. Issei wouldn't have been aware of this at the time, but he would later find out that there were apparently 2 traveling people, or well, just 2 travelers coming from the church. He had already had his interactions with the church, or what he presumed to be the Christian church at one point, and it wasn't necessarily all that pleasant. But he had no idea what these other two people were going to be like. He wasn't even aware at the time that these two people were even in his city. As far as Issei was concerned, he had just managed to make Asya essentially his servant, somebody that would obey his every command willingly, and they would take great pleasure in obeying him, as if they had a dopamine effect each time they obeyed his commands. Essentially, they managed to get the actual intent of Issei's desires, or well, just basically basically this. Every time that they did something good, they would get a dopamine effect. They would feel better about themselves. They would feel as if they got stronger each time they obeyed Issei's commands, which of course made it so that Asya would be more willing to obey his commands in the future. Now, as far as these two travelers were concerned, Issei wasn't even aware of them at the moment. Instead, he was just going to continue just observing Japan, learning about its culture. But he would eventually end up encountering them anyways, due to their connection with Rias in a sense. Rias had been trying to recover from the fact that she ended up losing to Riser and was forced to marry him. She did not like this man whatsoever, but she did appreciate the fact that he allowed her to just continue going to school, because, well, there wasn't really much to do down in the underworld, or at least her dimension. There wasn't really much of anything that none of her, not really her, but none of Riser's servants couldn't already do. Rias was essentially just a trophy wife to Riser. She was just there to just stand and look pretty for the most part. He didn't really care what she did, so that's why he allowed her to be so loose, essentially, with what she could do. Being able to just go back to school and act as if everything was normal was a bit uncomfortable for Rias. She appreciated it, but at the same time, it always bugged her that she was now shackled with somebody. She was basically tied down to this one guy, Riser Phoenix. But she would also end up having to deal with these two members of the church one day. They would actually approach Rias and mention how they were here in order to look for an ancient artifact, you could say. This artifact, not necessarily an artifact, but more so a legendary weapon in actuality. They were apparently looking for Excalibur. Somebody had apparently stolen it somehow, and their church had sent them in order to go look for it. They were just coming here to basically have Rias agree not to intervene in their search for the weapons. Or not weapons, weapon, which Rias would have no issue with. She had no issue with not getting involved in a situation that didn't truly even involve her. She didn't really care about the sacred weapon whatsoever. But of course, that would be a different story for Kiba. Kiba wanted to help in this search, but he knew that he really couldn't, especially with a sort of predicament right now. Rias had literally lost to Riser and forced to become his wife. She was in a bit of a sour mood, and to even try and step out of line was, well, practically a death sentence for, not even a death sentence, a death wish for Kiba. He knew that whenever it came on to an angry Rias or an upset Rias, it wasn't somebody that you wanted to really mess with. A sad Rias or like a somber sort of Rias, he could maybe get behind. A disappointed Rias, essentially, is somebody that he could handle, but this Rias, it seemed as if she was a ticking time bomb right now. She was less composed like she used to be, all because of the fact that she ended up becoming cocky in their training. She believed that they weren't good enough to rest for a while. They thought that they deserved a meaningful break after training with Issei's soldiers for a while. It was only a couple of days in actuality, and Rias afterwards called it a day. They just stopped training after a while. She believed that they had become exponentially stronger, but in the end, of course, that turned out to not be enough. Now Kiba, he wanted to become stronger in order to enact revenge. He remembered the Excalibur program, or the project, where they trying to make a suitable host for the Excalibur, somebody that could wield Excalibur, and because of that, he had to suffer. For years, he literally saw so many of his friends and family die, essentially all because of this stupid sword, and he had a vendetta against this sword all because of it. He was angry at the church and anybody who was involved with this sword. He wanted to make sure he had some involvement as well, just so that he could have the pleasure of at least destroying that sword. He wanted that sword to be destroyed for all the pain and suffering it caused him. But of course, he would not necessarily get his wish. Instead, he would just have to stand idle for the most part. Irina and Zenobia, they would continue to search for the sacred weapon Excalibur until they ended up encountering just who exactly held it or wielded it. So the person who stole it, and they would be in a state of shock. They wouldn't be able to even keep up with this enemy whatsoever because they were just too strong. They were on a whole nother 11. They were on a whole other level compared to the two of them, and they would easily be taken down. Zenobia, she would manage to escape though, while Irina, she would not necessarily be all that lucky. Zenobia, she would try and scout for some help. She would eventually try and find Rias's peerage, hoping that maybe, just maybe, they could ally for once and have a common enemy of sorts. They tried to have like a sort of peace treaty before, where it's like I don't get involved in your affairs, you don't get involved in mine, when it came on to the whole Excalibur thing. But things had taken a turn for the worse, and Zenobia, honestly, she needed as much help as possible. Rias would be unwilling to help in this situation though. She did not really want to get involved in the church's affairs. She'd already tried this before, trying to mess with other people's affairs, trying to get into other people's business. Well, not really, more so the other way around, more so like forcing somebody to get into her affairs. And now it was as if the tables had turned. But Rias, she was not willing to help. She was still bitter after everything, and she was, well, complacent, you could say. She was complacent in her situation. She didn't believe in any way of escaping whatsoever at this point. So she would just turn her back on Zenobia until Kokobeel made his presence known to everybody. He would have placed Irina's body on, well, the doorsteps to her, well, not even doorsteps, basically. Kokobeel would let himself be known by placing Irina's body by Rias's feet, and this would immediately disturb Rias, seeing just how beaten up the girl was. She was barely breathing, and they didn't have her healer on standby either. They were questioning whether she was going to die or not, but with everything that was happening, everything was spinning around. Zenobia, she didn't know what to do either. She was frustrated. She was angered seeing the position that her partner was in. She had cared for her partner for so long now. These two had basically become friends. They were close with each other. And now all of a sudden this demon, not even really a demon, this fallen angel, this crow, all of a sudden came in, swooped in, and basically beat up her comrade. He left her in a bloody pulp, and now he wanted to pick a fight with them all. She wanted to get her revenge, but she knew that she wasn't strong enough, and she hated herself for that. She was hoping to the Lord at this point that somebody would come and bring her a blessing at this point, help her to survive this situation. If there really was an individual up there, then maybe, just maybe, they would be able to help her in this situation, give her a blessing so that she may be able to survive, so that she may be able to see another day, so that Irina would also be able to see another day. That's something that she would practically be praying for at this moment. And well, surprisingly enough, somebody would actually arrive, and this would be Issei. Issei would have detected the magical disturbance, and he would have came over to Cool Academy to see just what was going on. He would realize that this was an individual that was seemingly part of this Christian mythology, he believed. What was the name of this guy? Or like this guy's race or whatever, this faction? Issei was rubbing his chin, trying to think, until he snapped his fingers. He pointed towards Kokobeel and mentioned that he was a fallen angel. Kokobeel would mention that, well, Issei was correct. Indeed, he was a fallen angel, and he asked who may Issei be. Issei would introduce himself, and he would mention how he is the son of, well, Anubis, and put sounded familiar, but Kokobeel, he couldn't place his finger on where he heard these names from before, especially this Anubis guy. He remembered hearing about this name before. He think he meant an individual by this name actually, but he just could not necessarily remember the face. He couldn't remember anything about the name besides the fact that it had some importance to it. There was something royal about it or something along those lines, but he knew that the name sounded powerful, but he just couldn't remember. Issei would be the one to jog his memories though. He would state that he is a god from the Egyptian faction, which this would actually cause everybody's eyes to widen. Well, not really Rias's own, but more so Zenobia and Kokobeel. Issei would look around and notice the battered state of Irina. He would actually immediately summon Asya. She would appear in the form of a sandstorm before forming into her regular self. She would look around, questioning what was the reason for Issei summoning her here, and Issei would just point over to the girl in the battered state. He would explain that he wanted for her to heal the girl. And, well, Asya, she would comply with no other words. She wouldn't even really bat an eye when Issei said those words. She would just go and deal with the matter. And within seconds, well, Irina would have been healed, which would amaze Rias with just how potent this girl's healing was. She honestly wished that she had Asya on her team. She could have used a healer back then when she was fighting, well, Riser, but apparently not. Apparently, she just couldn't have her. It was as if this world just did not like Rias whatsoever, and then she also had Issei all of a sudden pop in. Well, with this healer girl. So even if she wanted, she couldn't have been able to like win her over or anything. She knew that Issei just seemingly had everything going for him, while Rias, she did not. Her life was in shambles while Issei was just living in luxury to an extent, you could say. This boy was more mature than Rias, to say the very least. He had his priorities straight, while Rias, she did not. Nobody would want to really follow somebody like Rias after these most recent incidents, these most recent events. Now Issei, he would look over the Kokobeel, and he would also declare that the sword from now on was going to be his. Kokobeel would mention that Issei seemed to be quite a bit of a cocky person, a cocky brat, to just state that, oh, Excalibur was going to be his from now on. Yeah, right. He needed to be able to defeat this man in combat if we were to ever get this sword. He would need to prove his worth, and from the seams of it, Issei didn't seem all that strong. Sure, he may have some backing to his name or whatever, but what does that say about him specifically? He wanted to get a feel for just how strong Issei was himself. And Issei would oblige before summoning his shadow army. Well, okay, I'm thinking about another anime. Okay, not his shadow army, but you can kind of say it. Basically, he would basically summon his army of deceased soldiers. All of these Egyptian warriors throughout history, they would have shown up in the form of skeletons. Well, not even just skeletons. Basically, they would have shown up in the form of skeletons with some armor on them before sand began to envelop them and they began to take on their original forms as well. Kokobeel would question just what these pathetic puppets were going to do against him, until Issei revealed something more, that these guys were enhanced. And the more that Kokobeel began to think about it, the more familiar the name Anubis sounded to him. And now that he was looking at Issei's ability to summon a deceased army, an undead army essentially, he would begin to start thinking, just who did he know who had these abilities? Who exactly was part of the Egyptian mythology, the Egyptian faction, and was able to... Oh no. Once Kokobeel finally realized, once it finally clicked in Kokobeel's mind on just who Anubis was, he would immediately back off. He would not want any sort of smoke with Issei whatsoever. He realized where he was going wrong. He realized that he simply had no chance against Issei, and he especially did not want to get on Anubis' bad side, even if he wanted to actually take down Issei. He knew that the Egyptian faction did not play, especially the stricter ones like Anubis. People like Anubis, they were not at all that forgiving. They were fair, but they were, well, exactly that. They were fair. So if you were to just lose in the balance, well, it's like this. If you were to fail his scaling game, essentially where he measures your height, if your height is light, then you will basically be blessed. You won't have any issues with Anubis whatsoever. You will probably live in fertility or something along these lines. You will live in luxury for the rest of your afterlife. But if you were to fail, well, that's it. You are going to suffered by the hands of Anubis. That was how he basically fought. And although sometimes it would end up going in the people's favor, other times Anubis would have been the one to rip out their hearts. He would have been the one to wrap them up in bandages and leave them to die. All of these things, he had heard the stories of Anubis, and he was lucky enough to end up having an encounter with the man as well. But this was when Anubis was at probably his weakest. He had fought in these faction wars before, and it had taken a lot out of him. He was exhausted. He had fought for so long, and he was exhausted to the point where he was about to fall. But even then, he was still able to lay the knockdown on Kokobeel. Despite being at his very weakest, he was still far above Kokobeel. And Kokobeel, he already knew that his son had incredible potential. Any son of Anubis would have to have incredible potential. He did not want to mess with Issei or Anubis, especially an Anubis who was probably going to be even stronger than ever. And Anubis that was at full health, possibly. He didn't want to mess with that. So he would decide to relinquish the sword. He would decide to immediately give up. He did not want to have to deal with this Egyptian faction whatsoever. And Issei would be rather surprised, but he would smirk. He would say that it seemed that this Kokobeel guy managed to wise up. Kokobeel would nod his head in understanding, not necessarily understanding, but he would nod his head in agreement. He would mention that he had no idea that Issei was the son of that god. He did not want to have to deal with them in any form or matter. Well, Issei would have to admit that that was a very smart decision, because Issei was one thing, but Anubis, yeah, Issei was well aware of how his father got down at times, and Issei would look down at others. He wouldn't have even really had to use his zombie army, essentially. He didn't really have to use his army whatsoever. He didn't have to use the army of the undead. And so he would just release the Scorpion army. He would look over to Rias and everybody else, and he would mention that, hey, does anybody else need healing? Nobody would nod their head. Everybody would actually shake their heads in response. And, well, Irina and Zenobia, they would just look at Issei. And then they would also look over to Asya. Zenobia would make a comment about, well, Asya. She would mention how she recognized Asya. She thanked the girl for healing her friend, healing her comrade, Irina, but she would also make a comment about how, well, Asya was basically thrown out of the church. She was forgotten by the church. She was shunned by the church, to say the very least. And Asya, in response, would actually laugh. She would mention how she was glad that happened, because if it weren't for her getting thrown out of the church for healing a devil, she probably would have never ended up meeting Issei. And Issei had basically been a blessing in disguise for her. And she learned so many things from Issei so far, and she also realized something. You see, the guy that they've been worshipping this whole time, yeah, he's dead. They've been worshipping a dead man for the longest. Apparently, Issei's father, Anubis, was one of the gods of, well, the Egyptian mythology, or like the Egyptian faction, and they were well aware of everything that happened during the faction wars so many eons ago. And in that war, well, somebody actually managed to kill the god, kill the Christian god. And so the whole Christian faction, it's pretty much been out of whack. The whole Christian mythology or religion, whichever way you want to really describe it, it's been out of whack ever since. The angel Michael has been trying to keep some order, but even he can only do so much. When it came on to the other factions within the, Christian religion as well, they've also been struggling to maintain some form of balance. And of course, she would have just laughed at how these two reacted. Irina and Zenobia, they would have been crushed hearing that. They wouldn't know how to react. Zenobia would immediately go into denial, but Issei would confirm every word that, Asia just said. Zenobia called blasphemy, but Issei would just tell her to watch her tone. He would glare at her and summon some sand. Zenobia would just look at the sand unimpressed. She would comment on what exactly that was supposed to do, in which Issei would turn it into a sandstorm. It was as if she was in the Sahara Desert all of a sudden, but Issei would quickly disperse the sand, and it was as if she wasn't just hit by the sand whatsoever. It wasn't as if she was hit by a whole sandstorm. And Issei would just mention that it would probably be best not to test him, because this was him going light on her. Just imagine if he was actually angry. Nobody wanted to get on Issei's bad side, so it would be best for her to watch her tone from now on. Zenobia would whimper in response, and so would Irina. She had never seen her comrade act this way, act so subservient. But now that she really thought about it, Issei didn't seem like that bad of a leader. If it was true what they said, that the religion was basically in shambles at this point, then maybe it would be best to look into this Egyptian mythology. This man came during their times of need, so it would probably be best to also return the favor. Maybe help him as well. Irina would actually be the first one to offer herself here. She would offer to become a servant of Issei's, just like, Asia. And Issei would question if she was sure. Irina would nod her head in response. She was 100% positive in this decision. She did not want to even really think about deciding to go with any other decision here. She figured that Issei was going to be her best bet at having some form of foundation after everything that just happened, after she had been so shaken up from Kokobil's attack, and then him being so scared of Issei and his father. She knew that the only way to get strong was to be in, Issei's graces as well. When it came on to Zenobia, she was a bit less willing to join, but in the end, she would have just accepted. It actually would have taken Zenobia a couple of days, in all honesty. It was as if her whole world had just been destroyed, and it kind of was. She had grown up in this religion, and to find out that her god was dead, that was heartbreaking. That was something that kind of broke her mind. It was hard for her to really process this sort of information. Irina was able to take it a bit smoother, but Zenobia, she struggled until she finally figured that joining Issei would be her best shot at really surviving in this cruel world. And so she would end up finding Issei's location, and she would join his peerage as well. As the latest two members of Issei's, peerage, you could say, Irina and Zenobia would be bestowed upon new forms of clothing. This clothing would have been a bit different from Asia's own, where Asia had more of a belly dancer type of clothing. These two had more practical versions. When it came on to Irina and Zenobia, they ended up wearing what could be considered, well, Egyptian type robes or just clothing for whenever you're in the desert. Something that would be rather practical in these sort of environments, and considering where Egypt is located, it would make sense for them to have this sort of attire. It was designed for Egyptians after all. And when it came on to the newfound abilities as well, after joining Issei's peerage, well, when it came on to Zenobia, she found that although she was already able to open up a portal to engram Durandal, her famous sword, and there was another thing that she could open up at this point. It seemed as if Durandal ended up going through a metamorphosis of sorts. This metamorphosis caused for it to become brown, and it looked as if it had some sand on it for some reason. But she would quickly find out that this was for a reason, because now that dimension had turned into a sandy dune, or like basically a sand dimension of sorts. Yeah, basically she had control over her own pocket dimension. This pocket dimension, it worked like this. She could activate it, and she could go into it herself whenever she desired. But if she were to also strike an enemy with a sword, they could run the risk of being teleported to this location, to her pocket dimension. They could be stored within her pocket dimension, which could be extremely dangerous considering the fact that, well, it's kind of hard to escape that pocket dimension. You will have to find a way to break through that pocket dimension, or just find some sort of escape. But, well, that would be extremely hard with how Zenobia seemed to work. She was not a very forgetful person whatsoever. She wasn't just going to allow a person to escape this pocket dimension of hers. Oh no, instead they were going to suffer within that pocket dimension. And she realized that she could also store a good amount of things within that pocket dimension as well. She could have her enemies just die within her dimension, or she could store a bunch of items in that dimension and use them for later usage. She found that to be rather convenient, and Irina shared a similar ability. Well, in a sense, you could say. You see, Irina's ability was that she can mummify people. This kinda horrified her at first, but she realized that this could be rather useful in combat. When it came on to how this ability worked, it was whenever she ended up striking her opponent. If she was ever able to cut her opponent using her sword, well, that would cause for them to begin to mummify that area of their body. Say if they were to cut another person's arm, that person's arm would begin to mummify, while if she cut another part of the person's body, that part would also begin to dry up. The more parts that she ended up cutting, the faster the process would go, and eventually that person would just become a full-on, well, mummy, completely drained of all of their nutrients, their water supply. There was nothing but skin and bones to that person now. And this was something that Issei found to be fascinating, how these two could just have such amazing abilities. And you would look at Issei as well, and he would comment on how she was basically like the giver and taker of life as well. This was teaming up, not not really teaming up. This was beginning to become, a rather formidable team. This was something that Issei liked quite a bit. He never expected that this was going to be what happened whenever he came to Japan. He expected to just live in Japan for a couple weeks or months, just get a feel for the place and then go back home. But it seemed as if he was really going to like this place. And then, while at school, Issei would be called up somewhere. He would be called up to the front office, and not only that, but he would be sent up to another building actually right after. This building would essentially be where a meeting was being held place. Within this meeting, Issei would end up seeing, the fallen angels leader, the leader of, the devils, and then he would notice the leader of the angels. But then Issei would look around a bit more and realize something. His father was here. He would be extremely surprised to see his father here. And not only that, but Ra was here as well, the sun god Ra. This was something that Issei was not expecting whatsoever. All of these faction leaders here right now. Issei did not know what to say. He just wanted to know what was going on, but that answer would have to come in the next part. Issei, while he was in this room, would end up finding out from his father why he exactly was here. Why his father and Ra, the sun god Ra, were here. Anubis would end up explaining that they were all here because of the fact that the three factions were planning on creating a peace treaty with the Egyptian faction, which Issei found to be rather interesting. Sezek would actually speak up right after, mentioning that they had witnessed Issei's abilities. They had even fought in wars with the Egyptian mythology as well at one point, and the Egyptian mythology was able to give them a run for their money at times before. They knew just exactly how strong the Egyptian mythology was, but they also understood that one of the main reasons why they were so strong was because of the fact that they were also practically living in the desert, which was practically, low on resources at times. They understood that they needed support, and when it came on to, the devils, fallen angels, and angels themselves, they all needed a form of support. They all needed protection. They wanted to stop this senseless violence. They all wanted to have peace at this point. They understood that this would literally just be wasting resources, and they had lost so many people already due to these wars, due to all of this violence. So now they just wanted peace at this point, and they were hoping to have Issei's input in all of this as well. Just going by Anubis' words, because of the fact that he respected the son's decisions. Anubis figured that since Issei had been around in Japan for a while now, he should have a say in this sort of decision, this life-altering decision, considering the fact that they could either make peace with the devils, fallen angels, and angels, or like angels, devils, and fallen angels, whatever you want to call it, or they could continue this ongoing sense of violence or something else. Issei could be the one to decide, since he was the one that was gathering all of this information and just going by Anubis's order at first, but also he ended up collecting information, learning about these people of Japan, learning about the cultures of the devils, the fallen angels, just exactly how they acted, and yet even encountered some, prophets from the church as well, the Christian church. So Anubis wanted to hear his son's input on all of this. Maybe he could provide something that would be insightful, maybe something that would change Anubis's mind. He was rather indifferent towards this. He didn't really know which side to pick. Right about now, he was hearing from Ra that it would be a good idea to, join the treaty. But at the same time, he also had others from the, well, basically this. Anubis, although he was hearing a yes from Ra, he also ended up hearing some input from others in the, afterlife, saying that they should not agree to this treaty with the Christian factions, because they felt as if they were going to be tricksters or something along those lines. They felt as if this wasn't going to be a genuine treaty, that somebody was going to break this treaty and they would just go back into chaos very soon. So Anubis wanted to hear from his son what he felt, and Issei, at the end of the day, knowing that he literally has 3 people who came from the Christian church become part of his, faction, become part of his peerage, he would actually agree without any sense of reluctance whatsoever. This would surprise Anubis, not necessarily Issei's decision, but just how easily he said yes to it. There was no sort of hesitance, which Anubis was kind of happy to hear, that his son was confident in his own decision. With this decision being made by Issei, Anubis and Ra, they would get ready to sign the contract, or the, not necessarily contract, but treaty. But all of a sudden, how should I say it? The Chaos Brigade would suddenly appear out of nowhere. Kateria Leviathan would have barged into their room, and she would declare that she was going to be getting her revenge on the 4 Satans, Serzex, Seraphol, and the other 2 that weren't here for some reason. Unfortunately they weren't here, but they were going to kill all of these false devils, these false kings, or whatever you could call them. And that's basically how Kateria saw all of them, because of the fact that they stole her family birthright. They stole her family name and turned it into a title, something that she found to be utterly disrespectful. And she was going to get as much revenge as possible, but she would not be able to even say another word before Issei would actually just barge in and use an attack on her. Issei's attack would have been similar to, Agara's sand burial in a way, except, he's not around like a bunch of sand or anything. Issei would have been the one to create the sand, how about that? Issei would suddenly summon a sandstorm. Kateria would be teleported to a sandstorm all of a sudden, and she would be confused until sand began to envelop her in a pyramid-like fashion, and from there she would end up being crushed by the sand. Issei would have showed absolutely no mercy towards Kateria, because he understood that this girl was already bad news. He had heard about these, ancient devils, or whatever you want to call them. He had heard about them before. They weren't all that good. They weren't all that great to be dealing with. And Issei, he would also look towards these magicians or mages, whatever you really want to call them. He just laughed at how pitiful they looked. He would immediately go on an onslaught, killing off every single last one of these mages. They would have stood absolutely no chance against Issei. everybody would just be looking around, impressed by Issei's capabilities. They could tell where he got his power from. They could tell that this was really the son of Anubis. And there would be a person in the back watching the scene just go on, and just watching the fight go on, or like the massacre at this point, and that person would have been Valley Lucifer, the White Dragon Emperor. He was impressed. Issei was strong, really strong actually. The fact that he could just take down Katarina Leviathan as if she was nothing, that already spoke volumes towards Valley. Well, that already spoke volumes to Valley, and just letting him understand the difference in strength from everybody else in the room. Not everybody else in the room, but well, against his Red Dragon Emperor. Looking at it now, his Red Dragon Emperor, the guy that he had to face, was relatively weak. He didn't even stand a chance against Valley. It only took a couple of blows in order to defeat the Red Dragon Emperor, and Valley felt pretty empty during that fight. It was as if this was not a destined fight whatsoever. This fight felt so pathetic in Valley's eyes, and he demanded a rematch. He wanted to fight somebody who was stronger. He could never accomplish his goals if he was just going to be given weak annoyances like that Red Dragon Emperor. He killed that guy just because of how pathetic they were. He was hoping that the cycle would continue from there on, that they would just find another host, and hopefully that new host would have been stronger than the last one. But looking at Issei now, Valley had a feeling that this guy was going to be a good replacement for the Red Dragon Emperor. This guy was going to become his new rival. He was practically declaring it at this point. He declared it in his mind, and when Issei walked back down, Valley would walk up to Issei and tap his shoulder. Well, not just tap his shoulder. He would tap his shoulder. Issei would turn to look at Valley, confused, and Valley would end up reaching out, trying to have some form of handshake be formed. He would have had his hand stretched out, and Issei would have grabbed his hand. They would have shook hands, and they would have made eye contact as well. Issei would state his name, and Valley would state his name as well. Issei would be kind of surprised hearing the fact that his last name was Lucifer, and he was wondering if he had any sort of connection to the ancient devil Lucifer. To which Valley admitted that yeah, he did. He was technically a great grandson or whatever, but he didn't really care for his family name like that. He wasn't like Katarina, as you could tell. All he was really concerned about was just getting strong, and because of that, Valley was going to declare Issei to be his new rival from here on out. Issei would have laughed at first, but he would realize that Valley wasn't laughing. He was dead serious, which intrigued Issei. Okay, this is kind of interesting. He supposed that maybe this guy could give him a challenge, especially after what Azazel ended up telling him afterwards. Azazel would end up explaining to Issei that this was apparently the White Dragon Emperor, and he had already defeated the Red Dragon Emperor rather easily. There was literally no sort of issue when it came on to fighting the Red Dragon Emperor whatsoever. It was a massacre on, well, Valley's part. The fact that he could defeat the Red Dragon Emperor so easily. It was practically like he was fighting the weakest Red Dragon Emperor in history, and Valley would agree to that. Issei would be impressed, and he would have to admit that he would maybe have to look into Valley a bit more. Maybe, just maybe, this guy could be a worthy opponent in the future. The four factions would end up finally, well, writing or like signing the peace treaty, and from there, many other factions would become interested in this treaty, this whole peace treaty that was being made. The fact that the Egyptian faction as well even signed this treaty to begin with, one of the last factions you would ever expect to sign such a treaty. But they did, and now many others were trying to shoot their shot at well, in creating peace with the other factions. Nobody wants another war after all. While all of this was happening, this revolution, or like this, yeah, you could basically call it a revolution. This new, well, era being created for everyone. Issei would occupy his time by actually deciding to go to the underworld one day with his, well, peerage. And, well, Asya, she would have been part of this peerage, of course. She would have been the main one running the show, well, besides Issei. And while down in the underworld, they would explore quite a few places. They would find the underworld to be a rather entertaining place, and they would end up learning about these fights that ended up happening. These, well, rating games. Sure, Issa had heard of them before, but he had never really seen one up close like this, and he found them to be rather fascinating. He could probably add that to his, well, to his like pastime while he was in Egypt. Maybe just see like a couple of like undead people like fight or whatever, for like fun or something along them lines. Basically like a coliseum, you could say, just to fight for Issei's entertainment from time to time. And, well, there wasn't really much to do besides live in luxury, live in peace when he was up in his home in Egypt, and, well, of course, study in order to become the next holder of, well, the balance of life and death. But Issei would also end up learning another thing while he was down in the underworld. This, of course, would end up being, well, the devil that Asya ended up saving one day. The devil that ended up getting Asya kicked out of the church. He remembered hearing this from Zenobia at one point, but he didn't necessarily know who the devil was. And now that Issei was finally getting to meet them, he did not have any sort of reaction whatsoever. As a matter of fact, Theodora wouldn't even really acknowledge Issei. Instead, he would go straight for Asya, interestingly enough. This would have been the one that kind of ticked Issei off, but he would digress. He would try and keep a level head for this moment, and Theodora, he would mention how he was the devil that Asya had saved also many years ago. He never got the chance to thank Asya for saving him all those years back. He really appreciated their help, and in return, he wanted to marry her. The fact that she was so gracious, she had such a kind heart. He would just start spewing a whole bunch of lovey-dovey stuff in order to win Asya's heart. But in this timeline, she did not buy any of it. Now, she would actually reject his offer immediately. She would explain that she had no interest in Theodora whatsoever. She was perfectly fine with Issei, and Theodora would be kind of upset hearing this. And he would look up to Issei, wondering what he had over him. Issei, noticing that this guy wouldn't accept no for an answer, he would decide to kick it up a notch. He would ask Asya a question. This question would be whether she hated this guy or not. Asya would explain that she actually did not hate Theodora for what happened so many years ago. She did not have any sort of grudge against him whatsoever. Issei would ask her another question. Do you regret saving him? Do you regret meeting me? More so. Do you regret saving Theodora? And do you regret meeting me as a result of those years of suffering that you had to go through? Asya would explain that if she could go back and change anything in order to make sure that she had a better life, and within the church more specifically, she wouldn't do it. She wouldn't change a thing. If she could go back in time right now, she would not change a thing because of the fact that she admired Issei. She respected Issei to a fault. She appreciated Issei for everything that he did for her. He took her in when nobody else would. He actually gave her a welcoming home, unlike the fallen angels at the time, who only ever tried to use her. And the fact that she ended up learning about how, the biblical God was dead and all, this was crazy to her. But she noticed that the church was basically a cult, and Issei was her savior, her knight in shining armor. So of course she would not regret having met Issei. She did not even regret saving Theodora. And hearing all of this, Theodora would still be rather upset, but he would just look towards Issei, and Issei would just fold his arms. He would exude an aura of confidence, and this confidence would be overwhelming for, Theodora. It was literally as if Issei's willpower was being forced down Theodora's throat. It was practically forcing him to kneel before Issei. Theodora was practically about to kneel, but at the last moment he would just decide to walk away. He refused to kneel down to Issei. He knew about Issei's status, but he still felt as if him being a devil was worth more than anything that Issei ever was. Just because he was the son of Anubis didn't mean anything to Theodora. It was just the fact that he could not touch Issei right now. If he did touch Issei, then he did not know what the consequences could be. He did not want to face somebody of Anubis' caliber. He didn't know how strong Issei was, but he had heard the stories of Anubis, and that was frightening to Theodora. The fact that Issei could even force his will onto others like that was unnerving to Theodora. Loki wouldn't have dared trying to, attack Odin at this point. After finding out that Odin, of the Norse mythology, the Norse faction, was coming down to meet the devils in order to make a peace treaty with them. Loki was planning on going to kill Odin and create Ragnarok, kickstart Ragnarok, but after finding out that Anubis was going to be there as well in order to help proceed the treaty, Loki, he would immediately realize that was going to be a foolish move. He knew just exactly how strong Anubis was. Everybody knew how strong Anubis was. Everybody knew how strong Ra was. Everybody knew how strong the Egyptian mythology was. Nobody wanted to have any sort of smoke like that. Sure, there was some factions that could probably take on the Egyptian mythology, but at the same time, nobody wanted to go through such bloodshed again. That was the biggest issue out of all of it. And of course, at the end, Issei would have been in the middle of everything as well. Issei would have been a rather powerful individual. He inherited practically everything from his father and more. and Issei was only ever growing in strength every single day, so everybody would be rather alert. Theodore was one of the very few to step out of line while Issei was down in the underworld, just exploring the place. And when Issei left, he would have ended up finding out about this sort of field trip that was going to be happening. They were going to be going to not Cool Academy, but they were going to be going to they were going to be going to Kyoto. Man, I don't know why it took me so long. They were basically going to be going to Kyoto for a while, and while in Kyoto, Issei would end up having to battle against the hero faction. Apparently, they ended up kidnapping the yokai Fox Queen, and her name was Shisaka. Issei knew about the yokai. A little bit. He wasn't all that versed in them, but he understood that they had rather strong members, so Issei would have done his best against the hero faction. Plus, he also wanted these guys to join the peace treaty. He wanted everybody to join this peace treaty at this point. He didn't want to fight anybody anymore. He just wanted to live a life of comfort and knowledge. That's all Issei really asked for at this point. And he would have even had his, faction members, Irina, Zenobia, and Asya, all deal with the hero faction members as well. There are a great number of hero faction members. They would have all managed to kill a bunch of hero faction members, and the craziest part about it all was the fact that each and every last one of these hero faction members would have been teleported to the gates of judgment, or basically where Anubis would be judging you from here on out. Somebody would have been in place of Anubis for a while, but they would have done the job rather well. They would have balanced their hearts with a feather, and most of the hero faction members' hearts would have been heavier than a feather, meaning that their sins were far too much for this world, far too evil, and of course they would have ended up in a stone. They would have ended up as if they would have ended up in a bad situation, to say the very least. They would have ended up turning into stone. Some of them would have turned into stone, while others, they would have ended up having to suffer the wrath of Anubis tenfold. They would have ended up going through an eternal amount of agony, and at the end, Issei would have just been left with Cao Cao. Cao Cao would have looked around and realized that practically all of his men were defeated in a matter of moments, and Cao Cao would admit that he had been color impressed. He was rather impressed with Issei's, peerage members, but how strong was Issei, the son of Anubis? He had heard many stories about Anubis, and he had heard some about Issei as well. But as far as he was concerned, that's all they ever were, stories. He wanted to know what the real thing was like. He wanted to test out Issei's strength and see just how comparable a human was to a god. Their battle would be very one-sided. Yeah, I'm sorry, but Issei would just not be in a mood to really be fighting this guy, and instead Issei would just summoned a shadow. Why am I saying shadow army so many times? He would have summoned an undead army of soldiers to just wear down Cao Cao, while in the middle of fighting all of these undead zombies, these undead soldiers of Issei. Issei would have noticed that Cao Cao was beginning to wear down, and he would have also used this opportunity in order to make a beeline for him. He would have grabbed onto on Cao Cao's face at one point, and Cao Cao, he would have tried to rip Issei's hand off of his face, but Issei would have begun to absorb the moisture from Cao Cao. Eventually, he would be left in a corpse-like state, completely dried out and hollow. The army of Issei's, this undead army, would disappear right after. Issei would admit that he wasn't really in the mood for fighting. As a matter of fact, what Issei ended up doing was just distracting Cao Cao and draining his energy as time went by, until Issei found a good time to, well, kill him. And from there, Issei wouldn't be all that concerned with the hero faction anymore. Instead, Issei would have let it be known that Cao Cao, the leader of the hero faction, was dead, and now that he was dead, that meant that the hero faction had to depart. Or they could continue fighting, they could continue to fight for another day, but considering that the strongest member was dead, then how much more time did they really think they had? Issei would also end up rescuing Yasaka, and while there, Issei would end up recruiting Yasaka into his peerage as well, because of the fact that she was strong. And Yasaka, she had a bit of a liking towards Issei. She also had to admit that when it came onto the Egyptian mythology, if she became part of, well, Issei's peerage, that could practically mean an eternal protection for her faction as well. Which Issei would admit that she wasn't completely wrong, because, well, he could technically have some soldiers there to protect him at any time. They didn't really take that much energy out of Issei to maintain whatsoever. It was practically non-existent for how much energy he had to use in order to preserve these soldiers. It took more energy out of Issei in order to reform them, if anything. And even then, he could increase the strength of these soldiers at any time. These weren't even the elites of his army that he used most of the time, but they were still rather resilient. That's only if he really wanted to have them be resilient, though. If anything, he could send in like the absolute weakest and they could still get the job done of protecting, well, the yokai faction. But Issei would be rather generous. He would give them some of the elites, some of the strongest, in order to help them go by. But especially after hearing what Issei did to Cao Cao, it wouldn't even really be necessary. These guys wouldn't even have to fight anymore. All they had to do was just keep watch. Issei would have practically made Kyoto part of his territory at this point. And many people who thought that they were going to fight against Anubis and Issei, after finding out what happened to their leader, they would have quickly disbanded as well. Nobody wanted to deal with this amount of danger that came from the Egyptian mythology. Issei would continue to rack up more peerage members, and he would also become stronger as well. Eventually, Issei would become the next ruler of the dead, technically. He would end up taking over his father's role in the Egyptian mythology eventually. And that's basically it. He would have taken over the Egyptian mythology. The Egyptian mythology is undead. Not undead, but the, well, afterlife. He would have ended up taking over the afterlife from his father, and he would have ended up having to deal with more people from different factions wanting to join his peerage as well. Not only that, but he would have ended up making quite a bit of allies as time continued to go by, and more factions would begin to ally with Issei's own. They would have ended up establishing a form of peace, and Issei would have lived in luxury this sort of luxury that he had been dying for, but he would also just explore the world. His father had made him interested in exploring the world at this point, after his home thing in, well, Japan for a while, just learning about this severely different culture. And now Issei was content with life. He also had a couple of kids with some of his peerage members. He also had a couple of kids with some of his peerage members, and they were terrifying, to say the very least. Especially Yasaka's kid. She already had a daughter beforehand, but now that she ended up having another kid, but this time it was with Issei, the ruler of the dead, the guy who controlled the afterlife for Egyptians, and the fact that anybody who ended up being killed by an Egyptian god or somebody related to an Egyptian god would be sent over to the Egyptian graveyard, the Egyptian afterlife, the Egyptian judgment. That made things even more terrifying with how powerful their kid would be, because of the fact that they had control over that, and they had control over some of the abilities that Yasaka already had. So yes, Issei would be very strong, live a happy life, and his fox kid would end up becoming the next heir to the throne, because they were the most powerful out of all of them. And yeah, that's all I gotta say. You guys already know the deal. If you like the video, be sure to give it a like. If you've been rocking my content for a while, maybe hit that subscribe button, leave a comment, and maybe share as well. But beyond that, that's all I gotta really say. Time climbing to working time. Next time out. Peace.